All right. So audio and video, you said is lagging. Is lagging a lot. I just changed Wi-Fi.
He's fine now.
Okay. Yeah, so I just changed Wi-Fi so that hopefully it's better. Hopefully. All right. Before we jump into our not so upbeat topic for today, any questions from the past few weeks? Right. A couple of updates just to know. Um, One is that what I've been doing the past few years is having in the fall having a Hebrew class, and then in the spring having this class. And um, since I'm not going to, since after the high holidays I'm going to be taking a break for a few months, um, I probably won't be able to teach both in the next year. So if anybody really wants to learn Hebrew, locally I know that Rabbi Jana often teaches Hebrew classes, but beyond Rabbi Jana teaching, I can definitely offer some learn by yourself books. And also, I sent out in the email today that a link for Hebrew classes at American Jewish University. They're all online, um, and it's a big through the Intro to Judah Network. Um, it is a big discount, but it's a big discount at a university that is in a different Jewish community than ours, so it's still a little bit pricey. Um, so I think each class is about $365, but we get $100 off for um, for being intro students. Just to know that. The other thing to know is that I just sent out today a survey, and I would love for you to fill it out just so that I could learn a little bit more about teaching, and the intro program can learn a little bit more about how to improve their curriculum. They're updating it every year. And then the third thing is that next week we are going to have another not so happy topic. We're going to be talking a little bit about anti-Semitism and a little bit about the history behind the Shoah, the Holocaust. And what I'd love to do for next week is for each of us to either watch a documentary or read a book or some sort of writing, some sort of writing having to do with the Shoah. I just recently read a book called Afterlight, so that's going to be my book for next week. I'm pretty sure on the syllabus I have some examples of what could be read. Um, but if you could find something to read or to watch before next week, that would be lovely, and then we can bring our reflections about that and have our conversation based on that. Right. Shifting over, a personal question, doesn't have to be too personal, but when you or a loved one has been ill, words and action helpful or not helpful?
I think most of it is when there's a community thinking of you while going through the hard time. Um, no matter what one's belief is, that seemed to help my dad with his 5-year or still ongoing cancer battle.
Mm-hmm.
Um, just having people that actually showed that they care and kind of wanted him to have around helped tremendously with his depression and not wanting to be here or not wanting to fight. It helped him kind of find a happy spot with everything going on.
Having people around, having a community who's there.
Yeah, because in the beginning it wasn't the happiest times. It's you kept hearing about you do this, but then found work, family, and things like that. Kind of kicking him along the way. No, we're not tolerating this, and just thinking about him, praying for him, things like that. So No matter, I think that was a little comfort. No matter one's beliefs, they were just including them in whatever ritual they believe.
Love that. So including them, thoughts and prayers do have a place.
Yes.
Especially when people know that they are being thought about and when they're being spoken about.
Right.
Absolutely. Helpful is just giving people grace that people grieve in different ways. Absolutely.
Was that Anna?
Mm-hmm.
Starting to figure out her verbiage there.
For me, it's been giving extra time on things, not expecting me to show up every time. Absolutely. Absolutely.
That's a big one.
Mm-hmm.
Especially having like a chronic illness or something, and people feel guilty for making plans when they think they predict whether or not they're going to be able to make it. So instead of like disappointing everyone, they just won't commit at all.
Yeah, but it's really important though, because for some of us, we can say yes, and then we might not actually be able to make it.
Right.
Not because we don't want to, but because there's something with there's something really going on physically or psychologically. I know I've definitely had that before, and I remember how the way that I knew, who were the friends that were going to stick around were the ones who, even though I wasn't always able to make it when I wanted to, they were still there when I came, when I came to a better place. That they hadn't given up on me. Right. Exactly. Has anything not been so helpful when you or someone you love has been sick?
There has been times when people were a little overbearing or a little like too in your face. Um, some people do well with that, and some people like kind of like some time away from everything just to kind of go with whatever is going on.
Right. Sometimes not giving you that space, expecting you to always have something to say. Right. Mara says, I think it's sometimes just asking what would be helpful instead of just trying to be helpful. Of course, sometimes the person grieving won't know, but in that case, it's perhaps best just to leave the door open if they decide they want to talk later or need help with something.
That's usually how I'll leave it, especially in a bad situation. Hey, thinking about you. Know you got a lot going on. If and when you're ready, you know where to find me, basically.
Right, right. And sometimes there are things that we can find that we might assume, or that we might not assume would be helpful, but that we can hear would be helpful from the words that they're saying. I need X, Y, and Z. If somebody says, I need X, Y, and Z, I need somebody to help me out, and I'm having trouble finding somebody to help me out, right? Being that person, or being able to find that person. We learned in pastoral counseling that if the example of you visit somebody at the hospital and they say, I'm really, really cold, and they say over and over, I'm really cold, making sure that the nurse or somebody's going to bring them a blanket, or going to the nurse's station and bringing them a blanket, just to make till, because they might not know exactly what they want, and that's okay. But we can also listen to hear what are the things that could be helpful, not because, it would be helpful to me because when I was in that situation, or when it would have been helpful to me, but what is it that they're saying that they need? And I think all of this really has to do with the balance of having people around. Right? I think the scariest thing that I've heard from people are the situations in which there haven't been those people around. Right? When somebody has needed people and they haven't been present. So with all of that, we already have told the whole story of the Talmud. Not the entire Talmud, but this Talmudic story we're about to learn. But it's one of my favorite Talmudic stories about visiting the ill. Basically, this whole Talmudic story, we can read this little portion on its own, and we can read this whole story on its own, and it has meaning. But there's a lot more that can be learned if we think about what has happened before this in the Talmud. So this is right at the beginning of the Talmud. First tractate of the Talmud is Brachot. We are on page 5. The past couple of pages have been all about this question of is suffering worthwhile? And the dominant voice, the past few pages before this, was the more we suffer, the greater we're going to experience life in the world to come, right? God only puts suffering on people who God knows can deal with it, right? Those kinds of statements, right? Our suffering is worthwhile, it helps us build character, etc., etc., etc. And this is the last story in that series. Now, this is the middle story in a set of 3. So the first story looks a lot like this one, but are 2 different rabbis with a different ending line. And then I'll explain the third story after we get to the end of this one. So I'll start reading this one. Rabbi Chia bar Abba fell ill, and Rabbi Yochanan went to visit him. He asked him, "Do you want your suffering?" Or really in the Hebrew, "Is your suffering worthwhile?" And he answered, "Neither my suffering nor its reward." So he said to him, "Give me your hand." He did, and he raised him up to health. I didn't look at this. So this is story 1 and 2. Rabbi Yochanan fell ill, and Rabbi Hanina went to visit him. He asked him, "Do you want your suffering?" And he answered, "Neither my suffering nor its reward." He said to him, "Give me your hand." He did, and he raised him up to health. Is that really so? Why couldn't Rabbi Yochanan raise himself? It is, as they say, a prisoner cannot free himself from prison. This is the story that we've got presented in front of us, but there's also a third version of the story that's a little bit longer. So Rabbi Yochanan goes to visit somebody else, another rabbi who falls ill. And this person is really, really suffering, and Rabbi Yochanan says, "Well, why are you suffering? You're a Torah scholar, you're wonderful, you're fantastic, I don't understand what the issue is." And he cries, right? He says, I wish that I could be as beautiful as you. And he explains himself, right? And he can't fully explain himself, but he starts to cry, and Rabbi Yochanan cries with him, and then offers his hand and raises him up to health. So he sits there with him and then brings him up with him. So with this excerpt and knowing what comes afterwards, what are some of the messages that you take out of visiting the sick? And some of these are things that we already said. I think one is a lot of what you all mentioned before, of the importance of having people there. That idea, a prisoner cannot free himself from prison. Yes, we can do a whole lot. I love that. So Jade says, reminding them that they aren't alone. And Mark touched on that too, right? The importance of knowing that there are people there. Just the act of going to visit and being there is something in itself. We can do a whole lot to help ourselves, but at the end of the day, there's nothing that we can do entirely by ourselves in this world, and sometimes healing is in that category too.
Sometimes it's just having the distraction from whatever's going on, just to kind of give you a little reprieve or like a reset.
Having that distraction.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I mean, I can't tell you how many times Emma's been my therapist the last couple of weeks.
Thank you, Emma. Great. There's also, I think that question, do you want your suffering? Not my suffering or its reward. And especially after pages and pages and pages, she said anytime. After pages and pages of this idea that suffering is this worthwhile thing, this is the last word. That 3 rabbis say that my suffering is not worthwhile. Even if it has a reward, it's not worthwhile. That trying to get at not what so much what the problem is, but what is it like for you? Right? Validating the feeling that that person is having, because everybody goes through illness and grief differently, as Mara said.
Yeah, that's what I'm struggling with, is neither suffering nor its reward. That just sounds so final, like someone's done to me. But, brain works a weird way, so.
Right. And I think that's what these rabbis are struggling against, or what they're arguing against. This is the last word here. That even if, let's say that suffering has a reward, let's say that we're gonna have a beautiful world to come in the future because of all of our suffering, even then it's not worth it. I think bottom line is really what you all were saying before, that we need each other to heal. We need present. Sometimes the people present might not say the right thing. Sometimes the people present might be insensitive, but we do need people there to be giving us that support. I'm gonna unmute you for typing, or mute you, I meant. But you can always unmute yourself again. All right. We are going to go on from visiting the sick, although before we move on, it's always good to know that one of the first things that we say in the morning, one of the first Talmudic passages we say in the morning, is about studying Torah, and studying Torah as being opposite, or not opposite to, but being just as important as, or leading to, or on the same level as. The translation is weird, but all of these, studying Torah is opposite. Visiting the bride and groom, visiting the sick, right? Honoring parents, etc., etc., etc. So visiting the sick is one of the values that we highlight first, one of our most important mitzvot we could possibly do. All right, we're going to move on to speaking a little bit about death, about the end of life. First, we'll talk a little bit about Jewish ideas of what life ending might look like, and what our responsibilities are to our own bodies, what we can do with our own bodies, etc. We'll start out with that, and then we'll go on to talk about what all of that stuff has to do with mourning practices and with burial practices. But for now, the first question that we're going to ask is, what does Judaism have to say about life support, assisted suicide, organ donation, or autopsy? And we're going to read these 2 passages just as an introduction to that. So I'd like for you to take 2 minutes or so, 3 minutes, we'll say 7:30, and read these 2 passages. And as you're reading these passages, ask yourself the question, what do you think Judaism has to say about using and removing life support? About active euthanasia or about suicide? So we'll ask those questions in just a couple of minutes. This is from Rabbi Elliot Dorff, who's modern, and the Shulchan Aruch, which is the 16th century. So Anna, you're completely on track. She says, saying we don't have the right to unnecessarily destroy or damage God's property speaks to the idea that preserving life and health is sacred, but the unnecessarily indicates that in some circumstances it might be necessary. It's not a blanket prohibition on destruction and damage of the body, right? And that goes to a whole bunch of different notions. One is, as we've said before, that one of the greatest mitzvot that overrides almost every other mitzvah is pikuach nefesh, saving a life. So that's one thing that it certainly leads to. And Bryson says, does it not also not have to do anything? Does it also not have anything to do with undue suffering, loosely related nefesh? Undue suffering, I think, different point. So if we take the Shulchan Aruch, if there's something keeping somebody alive, and that's the only thing keeping them alive, all it's doing is delaying the soul's leaving of the body, it is permitted to remove these obstacles, right? So I think that goes along with the undue suffering. We don't want somebody to be in that position of suffering with only one thing. Let's say having being fed artificial food, being given food, being given drink through an IV or through a nose tube, if that's the one thing that's keeping them alive, right? Emma's saying, I don't see it necessarily covering the law of dual effect. What do you mean by the law of dual effect?
Well, that's the strict medical legal term. So what we'll do in end-of-life care is we'll stop taking vital signs like pulse, saturation, and blood pressure in the last 24 hours, and we'll give them opiate doses that might be lethal, might be hastening their death. We don't know. We're giving it for pain and comfort. We're not checking if it's killing the person, Mm-hmm. So that's the dual effect sort of plausible. We don't know thing.
And you're right on, because there's debate between all of the Jewish movements about the use of opioids at the end of life. So can we give somebody a dose of morphine that may possibly kill them, knowing that it's going to give them a whole lot of comfort at the end of life, especially in a hospice situation? And Rabbi Elliot Dorff is on the side of yes. And one of the rabbis that he agrees with on most other things, I'm drawing a blank to his name, but I'll look it up in a few minutes, says no. And so if we look at the conservative movement puts out an not a living will, but an advance directive, and I'll send that to you because it's a really interesting document. Puts out an advance directive with different information about what are some widely accepted Jewish responses to, let's say, if amputation would be a life-saving thing. Should I have a DNR in my advanced directive, and things like that. So Bryson says, I guess in Pikuach Nefesh, preserving a life, there's also a line in which you're doing the opposite if an obstacle prevents them from peacefully passing, right? That's what the Shulchan Aruch is saying. Absolutely. So for a couple of these things, we can address what large swaths of Judaism, not everybody, but what across the spectrum there are opinions on. So with life support, let's say with ventilators, if the ventilator is the only thing keeping somebody alive, for example, then it's widely thought of that the ventilator can be unplugged. Right? So there are questions about specifics, like about artificial food, but most of the time, if somebody's on some sort of life support and it's a machine and their body would not be able to function without that machine, and it's the only thing keeping them alive, right, then that can be removed, especially if the person is unconscious without any chance of gaining consciousness again. Right? But it's also seen as personal choice as well, through Advance Directive, through the family's decisions as well. The other thing that these will talk about, that these are assisted suicide and euthanasia. The idea, mainly in Judaism, most halachic movements are going to take the approach that that assisted suicide is not a choice that we have. So we don't have a choice to actively choose death, or for someone to choose to administer life-ending medication to us. So that's actually seen. While we can remove life support, while we can passive assisted suicide can be, I guess it wouldn't be called passive assisted suicide, but while passive hastening of life or hastening of death would be something that's seen as halachically okay, and a lot of times the right decision, assisted suicide is not yet seen as halachically appropriate. So Emma's saying, at my NeuroRads conference recently, they actually discussed brain death laws. Only in New Jersey is it explicitly stated in law that that if a family has religious objections to removing life support, the hospital has to try to make measures to accommodate. That's interesting. I hadn't heard that before. And speaking about brain death, if there's a whole lot of halachic material about what it means to still be living, and most halachists will say that brain death is death.
That was my kind of question that I was holding back, is what if they do the scan and, how does this fall if they see a little bit of brain activity versus no brain activity? Like, brain. You know, like say somebody had a serious accident and you know they still have a little bit response, but it's still unknown how it's going to go. Do you keep them on this life support, or do you go ahead and pull them off and let them see?
Right. I think if you're looking strictly at halakha, I think if they have a little bit of brain activity, that would be, then you would keep them on support. And it's also good to keep in mind that we've talked about this a lot. Judaism is a very embodied religion, and so as a very embodied religion, we really put a lot of faith and a lot of stock in medicine and doctors and medical advice. Same reason why on Yom Kippur or on all fast days, if our doctor tells us we shouldn't fast, or if we think, I don't think I'm ready to fast, we go by that. We go by our gut, or we go by our doctor's opinion. The Talmud talks about medicine every 5 seconds. So even though their ideas of medicine are not ideas that we should use today, their ideas of ways to heal might not be the right solution. It's very clear in the Talmud that that medicine is something that we look to. Doctors are people that we look to for support. So that covers when we're talking about life support, or we're talking about active suicide. I think on this page, I don't know in the newer version whether, what does it say? It does still say suicide. So in general, in Judaism, I just want to cover it, even though it doesn't have to do necessarily with the medical. Talking about dying by suicide in general, it's generally seen as halachically improper for somebody to, not halachically improper, but halachically forbidden for somebody to die by suicide. But I haven't met any rabbis or anyone in any modern Jewish tradition who would refuse somebody burial in a Jewish cemetery or full funeral rites or any of that for dying by suicide, because we understand today that in most cases it's an issue of mental health, right? That it's an illness. They're not dying from personal choice. They're dying from results from an illness. I'm going to wait to address organ donation and autopsy for just a second. Are there questions or comments? Just to let you know, this is not my area of specialty, but as I've said about other topics, Rabbi Elliot Dorff writes a lot about all of this, and when he writes a lot about all of this, he refers to other rabbis as well and to other books. So I would look at his, here's his book, Matters of Life and Death, A Jewish Approach to Modern Medical Ethics, and he wrote a newer one called Jews and Genes with a doctor more recently, a couple years ago. All right. Before we touch on organ donation and autopsy, it's really important that we mention one term, and that is kavod hamet, which is honoring the deceased. When a person dies, we have 2 periods of mourning. So from death until burial. What were the books again? His more recent book is Elliot Dorff's, yes, Jews and Genes, which I'm not sure if it talks specifically about this, but it talks about a lot of things in medical ethics. And then Matters of Life and Death is his book from 2003. And a lot of what he says in there is still relevant, even though it's 20 years old. And I can also lend those books, some of those books to you as well. So Kavod Hamet is honoring the dead. Yeah. Anything by Rabbi Elliot Dorff. Just search him on Amazon and
It's on your list.
yes, search him on Amazon and buy all of his things. He is a mensch and absolutely brilliant.
Do we get a discount for mentioning your discount code?
Probably not. All right, let me see if I think this is helpful in talking about Kavod Hamet, and then we'll go back. What page is this in?
212.
The new book is 212. Okay, so 212 in the new book. There are two stages plus, two main stages, or let's say three main stages in death and mourning. So when somebody dies,
That page is 215.
Oh, 215, sorry. 215. When somebody dies, we try to bury them as quickly as possible. And the mourner is in a period of aninut. We're going to talk about the mourner a little bit more, but I want to just kind of put this into two areas. So Kavod Hamet is respecting the dead. And during this period of time, from death until burial, that's what our focus is, right? Any of the immediate mourners, who we'll define a little bit later, but any of the immediate mourners are exempt from all of their positive mitzvot, don't need to pray, don't need to say the Shema, don't need to light Shabbat candles. Their focus is to be there for the deceased. During that time as well, we do a lot of bodily ritual. So we want to respect the human body by keeping it as intact as possible. We have a ritual of washing it and watching over it. This is guided by this Kabbalistic notion that this is a transitional phase, that while the person is dead but not yet in the ground, they're not quite sure where they are, and so we want to be there with them and comfort them throughout the process. And we also want to respect the body that kept this person alive and that made this person able to do and say all of the stuff that she did during her life. So during that first process, that's our focus, Kavod Hamet, respecting the dead. Now we're going to come back to this in a little bit, but keeping in mind that that one of the ways that we respect the dead, that we practice Kavod Hamet, is burying them as fully as we possibly can. Any thoughts, and weighing that against pikuach nefesh, that idea of saving a life. What are your thoughts on what mainstream halakha might say about organ donation or autopsy?
Well, originally I'd say it'd probably be against it because you're modifying the body, but if you're upholding life, then does that still apply even in death?
For organ donation?
Yes.
Yes. Yes. So remember that that pikuach nefesh trumps everything else. Right? So yes. So organ donation, especially if it involves donating a life-saving organ, even if it means having to cut into the body, Jews should be organ donors. We should all have it on our driver's license. I don't know if that's a thing here. That's a thing here, right?
It is.
I think it's a thing here. We should all have the organ donor sticker on our driver's license, because that pikuach nefesh, our ability to save a life even after we're gone, is more important than the preservation of all of our limbs and all of our organs in our bodies.
Yeah, it's on there.
Great.
It's in the little bottom corner.
Great. We've got the little heart that says donor.
Mhm.
Wonderful.
My parents hate it, but
Right. So organ donation, that's certainly organ donation. What about autopsy?
On that one, that gets a little questionable because it or mutilating the body to why one died, it's not saving a life. The life's already gone, so technically no.
Right. So in most cases, we do not support autopsy. There are some cases in which it's seen as legally necessary. So let's say that there's some legal case going on, then autopsy might be something. Autopsy would be something that we would do because of legal necessity. And also, if let's say that somebody dies from some condition, yes. So Jade's right, case by case, right? If somebody dies from a condition where doing an autopsy would help the living be able to survive for longer, if doing an autopsy might save a life in the future, even if
it's like a rare condition or
right.
something where they could use that for future studies, or like, then it would be fine.
Exactly. If you might use what you learn from an autopsy for future studies, then that would be considered okay. But if they're doing an autopsy just to figure out the certain cause of death, and there are no secular legal implications, and there's no way that this could help learn about saving others' lives, then we tend to shy away from autopsy, because we know of how long we often will have to wait to bury when there's an autopsy going on, and the cutting into the body, because we want to preserve that person's body as much as we can, because in Judaism, again, that our body is a huge part of who we are and what we do. It's not just our soul or our mind, but we work through our bodies as well. One other point to mention that's not on here is donating a body to science. So this isn't on here, but I've been asked this before. The first time I even thought about this was at my last synagogue. There was a 95-year-old woman who came up to me and she said, I'm very, very healthy. I am walking. My mind is still working well. I travel around the world. And my doctor said I should donate my body to science, because this is very rare, right? Once I eventually die, which I will because I'm getting older, my doctor wants me to donate my body to science so they can learn more about me. And I asked my rabbis, one of them being Rabbi Dorf, I asked them about Jewish approaches to donating a body to science. And I think, with the exception of a rare disease, like you were talking about with autopsies, with the exception of a rare disease, it's actually commonly said in halachic circles, conservative, Orthodox, and I think a lot of Reform rabbis would say this too, that we don't want to donate bodies to science, mainly because of that huge amount of time that's taken between death and burial, and everything that goes into, let's say that the body is used by a medical school, everything that body is going to go through in that time is seen as too much, right? It's too much intrusion with the body. But yes, I think if it's for finding out more about a rare disease, I think that would be an exception. And also, what I've heard also is that right now, or I don't know if right now, but as of the time I initially asked that question, so about 5 years ago, there in a whole lot of hospitals, there were too many bodies, and in medical schools, too many bodies being donated, or there are a whole lot of unidentified bodies that are often used. And also that a lot of this is being done by robotics. So that was not a doctor. I don't know that for sure, but that was how it was explained to me. And so autopsy and donating a body to science are both. Her boarding school had a human skull. Lovely, wonderful. But that's kind of where we get that halachic hesitancy towards autopsy and donating a body to science. In Judaism, we will always give preference to burying the body. They could not dispose of it because they did not know whose it was, right? I have priest friends who will talk about randomly, because they do services with cremains, who have found cremains in their offices with no idea whose they are, right? Someone left them there. So apparently that happens. Can't really learn much from cremains, but all the more reason to make that time between death and burial even shorter, so that we make sure we know where our loved ones are going. We talked about kavod hamet. What does kavod hamet mean again?
Respecting the deceased.
Respecting the deceased. Cremation versus burial. So for all of the reasons, all of the bodily reasons we talked about before, and we will always give preference to burial over cremation. At our particular cemetery, we as of now have not taken cremains to be buried. We have only done burials in our cemetery. And we try to make sure that that's financially doable for all families, because we know that burials are often more expensive than cremation, a lot more expensive than cremation.
So we prefer the burial over the cremation.
Right, because we want to have that body intact. And also we want to respect that idea of from dust we came, and to dust we will return. And while cremation will turn somebody into ashes or into dust, we want to respect the natural process of that.
Now, the extenuating circumstance, say something happened to a loved one, and say by the time you got around, the body's like really in no shape for the burial or preservation, would cremation be acceptable at that point?
So let me cover that in a second, actually. Okay. That's a good question. So in the preparation of the body, between that time, between death and burial, we have a couple of rituals that we commonly do. And at Agudat Achim, for example, we'll always ask the family if they want to do these rituals. For some, it seems a little superstitious and a little strange, so that's not required from every family, but it's seen as traditionally Jewish tradition to do this between burial and death, so much so that that the group of volunteers who do this work, called the Chevra Kaddisha, historically, when Jews have come to new places, the Chevra Kaddisha is most often set up before the synagogue, before the prayer space is set up, to make sure that we have something to do with those who die. So the Chevra Kaddisha and the cemetery are usually set up before the synagogue. So Chevra Kaddisha, their jobs differ in different synagogues, but their two main rituals that they do are tahara and shmira. So tahara, it literally means purity or cleanliness, and it's this process of washing the deceased's body. We do this at Rose Neath here in Shreveport. So we will, once a person dies and their family says that they'd like for tahara to be done, we've got a group of 4 or 5 women for a men for a man, and we've got a group of 4 or 5 who will wash the body in a particular way and dress them in white, for this idea of the same color that we wear on Yom Kippur, the same color that we wear at our weddings, this idea of coming into whatever comes after death completely clean and pure and ready. So we clean them as well as we can. We dress them in what are called tachrichin, which are shrouds. They're white garments. There's a particular garments that we wear, or that we dress the deceased in, and it's a really powerful ritual with particular liturgy. a lot of it from Song of Songs. And so if anybody's actually interested in being a part of our Chevra Kadisha here in Shreveport, please let me know. I know that it is not for everybody because we are present with the deceased and their body, but we spend a lot of time making sure that they're covered in a way that's respectful. And it's lovely too because it's a good opportunity for us to share stories about the deceased, for us to refer to her when we're washing her, when we're saying the prayers, we're always referring to her by name because she's still present. Great. So Jade would like to volunteer. Wonderful.
I was going to say I'll do it.
And Mark would love to volunteer too. Great. So Tahara is the more physical ritual. Shmira is another ritual. I think, Mark, have you done this before? Have you done Shmira here?
Remind me what?
Maybe. Oh, you know what? I don't know if anybody has died since
No, not
you
since
started
I've been
coming.
here. No.
But
And I didn't do it. I don't think we did that for my person. So.
It's more recent that we started doing this again here. So Shmira is the idea. Shmira literally means guarding or watching, observing, and there's the idea between death and burial that the deceased is in this transitional state that they don't really know where they are in the world or where they are in the universe, and so we want to make sure that we have people accompanying them through the whole process. So the Shmira process is that idea of making sure there's somebody with them at all times. Here at Agudath Achim, the way that we do this, and it's done differently in different places, is once we're done with Tahara, which is often the night before the funeral, or the day before the funeral, once we're done with Tahara, we bring the deceased to the synagogue, actually to this room, and we set up some water and some books and some journals for reflection in this room, and we all take shifts to spend time with the deceased. It's often overnight. So we'll each take a shift or two. Each person who volunteers takes a shift or two just to sit with the deceased in the room. And for a lot of people, it's a good opportunity, especially if we have the obituary, to learn a little bit about the deceased. I think one family brought a whole family history, and so people overnight were able to learn about that person's family history. So the two big rituals, Tahara, that washing, and Shmira, that watching, the washing and the watching, are the two big things that the Chevra Kadisha put together.
So you said they learn about the family history and then they kind of journal about it while they're...
Yeah, and it's in most places, the most common ritual that's done during Shmira is just reading Psalms. So what we'll do here is we'll have a bunch of Jewish books out. We'll have books of Psalms out. And for each person, their experience during Shmira is going to be something different. But it's a time to at least just be in the room with the deceased. And there's always a memorial candle out during Shmira.
Like that one?
Right, that's why we have all those. Okay. Like all of those candles.
They have those and then they
Great.
have the smaller
Here,
one.
I'll take. Yeah. They have. Oh, that's a good distinction. I'll explain that too.
One's just like the annual year or yard site.
Right.
One. Okay.
Exactly. So this is a Shiva candle. I'll explain Shiva in a little bit, but these are the kinds of candles that we'll have out in this room.
That one will burn for 7 days.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So Kriya is, I find it interesting that they put this at the end of the page, but Kriya is the ritual that we do when a person has, after the loved ones hear the news that a person has died. It's customary to tear a piece of clothing, whatever piece of clothing that they're wearing, and they'll wear that the entire week after that person has been buried. Now in a day and age where people don't like to rip their clothing, I'm sure no one ever did, but now what's more what's more customary is that we have these little black ribbons, and people will pin those little black ribbons to their clothing for the week and rip the black ribbon, rip the black ribbon at the funeral, or if they have black ribbons present once they hear about the death. So this idea of kind of heartbreaking, right? Literal tearing of the heart, and also that physical output that sometimes we're angry or need some sort of physical outlet for all of what we're feeling when somebody dies, and so there's this physical action that we do. The funeral service itself is going to look very different. Basically, the only thing that we need in a funeral service is putting that person in the ground, but there are other parts of the funeral service to keep in mind, or that you might expect if you go to a Jewish funeral. Like many other funerals in other religious traditions, there are a lot of psalms involved. So Psalm 23 is the big one, right? Adonai is my shepherd, I shall not lack. He makes me to lie down in green pastures. You may have heard this, whether in some sort of house of worship or on TV. Right? Psalm 23 is the biggie, and there are others too. Usually when I'm leading a funeral service, the day before I'll meet with the family, I'll learn a little bit about the person who has died, and I'll pick out some psalms and readings that really characterize their life. There's an El Malei Rachamim, which is a prayer to God to help the deceased go somewhere that's comforting and somewhere that's positive. Right? We're going to talk about in a little bit that we don't really have a stable idea of the afterlife in Judaism, but wherever our deceased goes, we want it to be pleasant, we want it to be good, especially if their soul is intact and present. So we say this El Malei Rachamim to send their soul upwards, wherever upwards might be. We then have Hesped, which is just basically a eulogy. Usually the rabbi or whoever is leading the service will give a eulogy, and then whatever family members would like to give a eulogy as well. And then we have shoveling, which is known as Chesed Shel Emet, which is loving deed of loving kindness of truth. So Chesed is deed of loving kindness, and Emet is truth. Or let's say a true deed of loving kindness. That idea that just as the deceased guided us through every single step of life, or through whatever steps of life they were present in, it's our job, not just as the immediate mourners, but as everybody present at the funeral who feels comfortable doing so, to help bury them. So once they're lowered into the ground,
so everyone can pitch in.
Right. So once they're lowered into the ground, we usually at a Jewish funeral, especially if the weather is permitting, there will be a few shovels around and the mound of dirt that was taken out of the ground to make room for them. And so there will be a line of people, and every person will make sure that they contribute to the shoveling. For some, it's a traumatic experience. For some, it's a physically rewarding experience. But again, because we're that embodied tradition, we want to make sure to be there to tuck them in, and make sure that even up until that last moment, that it's not a tractor that's putting all of that dirt in, even though that might be the last step, while that person's casket is still present, we want to make sure or while that person's casket is still visible, we want to make sure that the casket is covered by the people who are present. Some will actually have the tradition of not allowing any tractor to be present, and of having the family do the entire deed themselves. Also,
that's an interesting way to look at it, because what I've always experienced is the family goes, there's quick little service by like the graveside, and then everybody goes and forgets, and then days later you see that it's filled, and you watch for the ground to settle, and then you put a headstone out there. So everybody partaking and doing it, that's a whole different
It's a whole different emotional experience,
Yes.
especially when you hear the sounds of the shovels. Often people will also put dirt from the land of Israel into the grave as well. One other thing to note, going back to Tahara, is when we bury someone, we will most often put them in a plain pine box so that they can be involved in that process of decomposition as naturally as possible. Right?
So no embalming them or anything?
No embalming.
Oh.
Right. So it's a pretty natural process. In Israel, actually, they don't. In a lot of cases, they actually won't bury in a casket. They'll put them directly into the ground with like in a bag or something. But
because there was a piece where you can turn your loved one into like a pod where a tree can grow.
Mm-hmm.
Is that kind of the same thing, or
it could be?
oh.
I would see that as halachically, as long as that person is being buried with their full body.
Okay.
Then absolutely. You had asked the question before, what if the person is in a traumatic incident? Let's say the person was in a natural disaster or a car crash or something like that. When we're doing tahara, we'll always ask questions from the funeral home beforehand to see what kind of state in. Is this somebody that we're actually able to clean and to bathe and to dress without quite honestly, without leakage or without or is this somewhere and we're able to physically wash and take care of? Is their body in a full enough state? If it's something like medical devices, if the Tahara team has doctors or nurses on the team who know how to clip off medical devices or take off bandages in a way that nothing ruptures, then great. If not, we leave them in and we clean around them. But with cases of trauma, we will keep them in a bag if we have to, and then we'll lay the clothing on top and put them in a plain pine box. But even then, we try not to do cremation.
Interesting. Okay.
We want to honor every part of their life they had, even the very end of their life, up until the very end. And this quote at the bottom is El Malei Rachamim. So it's from that prayer, God, source of compassion, who dwells on high, may the soul of our loved one find shelter under your wings. All right.
Isn't it much longer than that? It's long.
It's longer than that, and if we have a couple of minutes, I'll bring out the siddur so we can look at it. Questions up until this point, because we've talked about kavod hamet, we've talked about everything from death to funeral as of now. Right. Once a person has died, we move on to nichum avelim. So right at that moment, in the middle of the funeral service or towards the end of the funeral service, when the deceased is in the ground, the focus shifts from the dead to the mourners.
I have a question.
Yeah.
And I guess, well, I'm curious what the cost of a Jewish burial is compared to maybe that of some other religions, especially since, there is, I guess some parts that are more simplified just in, making sure that body, I don't say return to nature, that kind of sounds hippy-dippy, but yeah, like even down to putting them into a pine box opposed to like a $10,000, coffin or something. Is is it a more cost-effective process?
Yeah, it absolutely
as
is.
well?
You don't have to do the embalming. It doesn't have to be the embalming, and the plain pine box is always going to be the casket that they have in the back room that they don't want to show anybody because it's less expensive than all the rest. We have here in Shreveport, we are blessed to have Roseneath Funeral Homes. We have a representative who works directly with the Jewish community, and so he's attentive to our needs, and he's attentive to the financial needs of the people present. It's still very expensive. So if we're doing a Jewish funeral, it's going to end up with no bells and whistles. It's going to end up being, I think, $6,000 or $7,000 the last time I checked. Our plots are, I'll look at our website and see the cost of buying a plot beforehand, but I know that it's way less than other parts of the country. I don't know about other cemeteries around, but I'd also love to take, for those who haven't been to our cemetery before, I'd love to take you on a tour, because it really is a beautiful space, and we have some quite old
Is this shared by
plots.
both congregations?
It is not. So in Shreveport we have four Jewish cemeteries. Two are really in. There are really only two that are in use right now. Three of them are specifically Jewish. Ours is on Yale and Walnut, so close to Line Avenue, and ours is specifically Jewish, and it's our congregation cemetery. The other two, I think, were both. One of them is a combination of both synagogues. One of them is mostly B'nai Zion, and then B'nai Zion nowadays buries most often in Greenwood Cemetery, which is a very, very large cemetery, and there's a small section for Jewish burials. But we at Agudath Achim keep our own cemetery.
Is that the project that Elliot and Candace are working?
That is what Elliot and Candace are working on. Yeah. So I'm happy to bring people there if you're interested in touring.
I just was driving around downtown and saw the historic B'nai Zion, or Zion Congregation Building is what I think it was called.
Right. The Jewish community used to be mainly downtown, because we have a whole street of department stores and pawn shops and dress shops and all of those things. We were kind of the merchants of downtown up until the 70s.
They were open on Sunday, I bet, while everyone else was closed.
I have my neighbor who's in her 80s said that when she was growing up, her mom kept, and she's very much Southern Baptist, she said her mom kept a Jewish calendar so that she would know which days the department stores would be closed downtown. Everyone knew that you go to the department store, it runs on Jewish time.
I've heard of that before.
Yep. All right, so we have that first step of Kabod HaMet. Then, once that person has been buried, we move on to this idea of Nichum Avelim, which is comforting the living. From the days, from death to burial, the person in mourning is going through aninut, right? Doesn't do any positive mitzvot because they're focused on the person who has died. Once we hit burial, we get to the period of avelut, which is a period of mourning. Right? Avelut in general is a term about mourning, and one of the last things that we do in our funeral is Kaddish, mourner's Kaddish. If we have time at the end of today, we'll watch a little video on mourner's Kaddish. We say Kaddish a lot during services, so I want to make sure that we cover that and we see what's the point of this prayer that we say that's called Kaddish. We say it in mourning, we say it in between different sections of the prayer, But when we get to mourner's Kaddish in a service or at the funeral, anybody who is an immediate relative, so immediate relative means brother, sister, husband, wife, brother, sister, husband, wife, son, daughter, mother, father.
So it's a blood
Right.
relative. It's not like your chosen family partakes, right?
Right. So halachically, it's these particular relatives, but anyone in Kaddish, if you identify as an immediate relative, whether it's a blood relative or not. And a lot of times people will stand and say Kaddish with their loved ones who are immediate relatives, so that to be in support. So you'll often see if somebody's parents have died, their spouse will stand up with them to say mourner's Kaddish. So Kaddish is said for the first time by the mourners at the funeral, and the last words for Kaddish are a blessing said to the mourners, which is Hamakom Yinachem. Starts with Hamakom Yinachem. So it's Hamakom Yinachem Etchem Betoch Sha'ar Avelei Tzion V'Yerushalayim, which is very long, but if you want to say a beautiful greeting or the right greeting to somebody who is in mourning in the Jewish community, Hamakom Yinachem will be good. It's literally, may the omnipresent one. Hamakom literally means the place, but this is referring to God. May God comfort you among all of the mourners of Zion and Jerusalem. Right. May the omnipresent one comfort you among all of the mourners of Zion and Jerusalem. And so with that, we shift into what's called Shiva. Usually after the funeral, there's a big meal, and halachically the family is not supposed to provide the meal. The community is supposed to provide all of the food. There's a big meal. It'll be we'll do a service with the meal. And the whole point of the meal is to provide the mourners with something to eat. For Shiva, what is most traditional is Shiva is for 7 days, including the day of the funeral. So for 7 days, the family will stay at home, and people will bring them food, and people will visit them. They'll cover mirrors. They won't go out to get groceries. Somebody else will get groceries for them. It's really a time to take care of those people, and a time for those people to really sit with their grief, right? To not be distracted by anything else. So if you're ever invited to a Shiva minyan or to a Shiva house, you always want to bring some sort of food, because even though in many modern households they're still going to go out and buy groceries, you want to be providing that sustenance for them. So at a Shiva house, you can expect to visit. It's often in a Shiva house for not much talking to happen, but just like we said before, sitting with the person is often enough. So there's often visiting, there's often a service involved, there's often food. But a lot of this is surrounded around food, so that the mourners can get that nourishment, can remember that they are among the living as well. So that's the first 7 days. Then for the first 30 days, Shloshime, in fact, I'll go to the next page, because that makes it a little bit easier. So Shiva starts burial first 7 days. Shloshime is from death, first 30 days after death. And for Shloshime, all of the immediate relatives are going to keep saying Kaddish. There are other mourning rituals, so they won't go to fancy parties, or they won't shave if they're for men. So they won't go to live music events. That's customary for Shloshime for those first 30 days. And then for people who have lost their parents specifically, they'll go through a period of saying Kaddish for their parents for up to 11 months. Because we don't want to do a full year, because we don't want to think that our loved ones were that our loved ones need us. They were perfect as is. We don't really they don't need a whole lot from us. They don't need a full year of us saying prayers on their behalf. Just 11 months. So especially if you've lost a parent, that's the whole 11 months. And there are a lot of people who won't go to any parties, who won't see any live music, who will take on a whole bunch of mourning rituals for those 11 months.
I remember that because Rabbi Jana's family is very musical, and she specifically mentioned when their father died, going the time period without any music was very weird and very difficult as well.
Right. Exactly. So after a year from death, that's every single year after a person has died, is the yahrzeit. So that's why at Agudath Achim we have little lights in the sanctuary. That's to denote people's yahrzeits. We have yahrzeits all the way back from the 1860s in our 1890s on our wall, and I encourage you, next time you go to a synagogue, it probably has yahrzeit lights. At least the older synagogues do.
They're very warm when they're all lit up.
They're very warm, but we're slowly but surely moving them to LEDs. But they are very warm. But a lot of people will have yahrzeits that they remember in our family. So today, for example, is my bubby, my grandmother's yahrzeit, and so my aunt and I spoke about her a bit this morning.
Aunt Marcy.
My Aunt Marcy, yeah.
I liked her.
I'm glad. She'll be back. And then on each holiday, anybody who has ever mourned anybody will say Yizkor, will say a series of memorial prayers on Yom Kippur, Passover, Shavuot, and Sukkot. There's a specific memorial service for each of these holidays. Also, after the first yahrzeit, we'll often wait to put up the headstone until that first yahrzeit, and so we'll have the unveiling of that headstone around the first yahrzeit. Great. All right. There's a lot of technicalities. Are there other things you've seen in Jewish mourning or in Jewish funeral services before? I've heard a whole lot of people explain that that this mourning process is what brought them back to Judaism, because it's a guiding process that gives us things to do and steps to take and people to be around at each part of the process.
So at Yizkor, you said you mourn anybody, or you?
Anyone, right. You would mourn anyone in your immediate family or anyone you would consider immediate family. You know what? I would like to finish with Kaddish rather than with afterlife. We can talk about the afterlife next week because it's interesting, but I think Kaddish is a little bit more important to us to dwell on. So I would love to. I'm going to get some Sidurim for Mark and me. If you have a Siddur, if you have a prayer book at home, oh, there's one right there. Great. If you have a Siddur or a prayer book at home, then you can get that. In fact, I actually think I have one here. Never mind. I've got it online. So Mourner's Kaddish is said once or twice during every prayer service when there's a minyan. So that's when there is a full Jewish community, a full quorum of 10 Jewish adults in the room. There are lots of different versions of Kaddish throughout the service. And in the email that I sent today, there's a great video explaining the history of Kaddish. But mourner's Kaddish is what we think of most often when we're talking about Kaddish. If I can find it. And this is the prayer I will often say that if you're in a period of mourning or observing a yard site, please rise and recite with me. Let's share this. Oops. English, that's not helpful. English translation can be found on page 12, which was very far back. So this is the prayer you may have heard it. Yitkadal v'yitkadash shemei rabbah be'alma divra kirutei v'yamlich malchutei b'chayechon v'yamechon v'chayed I don't have page. All right.
Talking about in ours?
No, I was looking for the English translation, which we don't have. So I'm going to read it, because apparently it's on a page we don't have.
I can go get the red book that's got the English.
That's okay. This one's got one.
Okay.
So I'll just read it out loud, and if you've got a prayer book, you might have a different translation. But when we're saying that prayer, Yitkadal v'yitkadash shemei rabbah, which you have probably heard if you've been to any Jewish service, these are actually the words that we're saying. And the question I want to ask, the last question I'm going to ask us tonight, is what in the world, or why in the world would we be saying this prayer about when we're in mourning for somebody? Because we're not talking about death anywhere in here.
Is it a blessing? Is it more blessing, right?
Let's see. So here's the translation. May God's name be exalted and hallowed throughout the world. May God's sovereignty soon be extended during our life and the life of all Israel, and let us say, Amen. May God's great name be praised throughout all time. Glorified and celebrated, lauded and worshipped, exalted and honored, extolled and acclaimed may the Holy One be. Praised beyond all song and psalm, beyond all tributes that mortals can utter, and let us say, Amen. Let there be abundant peace from heaven with life's goodness for us and all Israel, and let us say, Amen. May the one who brings peace to God's universe bring peace to us and to all Israel, and let us say, Amen. Why in the world are we saying this after mourning, or while we're mourning?
So it's acknowledging God and all He's done, or even during this time of sadness or mourning.
During this time of sadness or mourning, we still want to remember everything that God's done. Let's say for the person who we're mourning, or let's say for us in providing that person to us in our lives. That's certainly one way, for sure.
I can definitely speak from personal experience. It's really easy to, when you're already in a bad headspace after somebody's passed, to spiral.
Mm-hmm.
And, to on the daily say mourner's Kaddish, it's if you don't hear another good word or another positive word that, God's still here for you, if you don't feel like anyone else is, then maybe that's what that's for.
Hi, it's almost full circle, because at the beginning of class today we talked about how we need people there, and sometimes we don't have that support. So maybe just that mention of God provides that support. Also, because this is only said in community. This is only said when we have a significant number of people together. And so we come together in these spaces in significant numbers of people so that we can support each other. When we say Kaddish, we're surrounded by people. There's no way that we could think that we're totally alone, because not only is God present, but we've got at least 9 other people present with us, if not more. Absolutely. That's community, regardless of words. I used to have a rabbi who said, regardless of the words, this is our communal prayer. This is our way to be with other people. There are people who, in communities with big enough synagogues, who will go to synagogue twice a day and make sure that they're saying Kaddish throughout their entire Shloshime or Shloshime or year of Yartzeit, that first year of Yartzeit, when they're in mourning, surrounded by community, and so they're affirmation to themselves. And Bryson says, are you putting your trust in God at this point? Yeah, I mean, that's certainly one way to do it too, right? This stinks. God, I'm putting it in your hands, and I'm gonna be here and put it in God's hands at this point. And you all, I feel like, are having much more positive reactions. For me, when I read this, and it's probably different with each different loved one and each different situation, but I love how the prayer is in future tense. It's not saying that God is wonderful and fantastic and magical and bringing peace right now. It's all in future tense. So for me, when I say this, it's a plea. It's, God, can you please be wonderful and fantastic and lauded and worshipped and honored, and can you please bring us peace, because right now it might not feel like there's a whole lot of peace around. And it's also a plea to self that, may we be able to come back to God. Right? For those of us who find God in times of mourning, and the idea of God glorified and celebrated. But for those of us who it's hard to embrace that God is present, it's also a plea, God, can you stay there so that I can come back to you when I'm ready? And hopefully, can I be guided to come back to you by the people I'm remembering? Can my memory of this person bring me back to you in action, in thought, and all of that? Also, markedly, there is a different version of Kaddish. There's one line that we don't say when we're in mourning. It's Titkabel tzloton uva uton dekol Beit Yisrael, which is saying, God, God, please accept all of my pleas and prayers today. We don't say that when we're in mourning because we can't possibly have all of our prayers and pleas accepted when we're in mourning. We might want to ask for that person back, but
true.
We might want to ask for that person back, and there's no way that God can make that happen, that even God can make that happen. That last line is one that many of us are familiar with. Oseh shalom bimromav, hu ya'aseh shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael ve'imru amen. Many of us have grown up singing it, or it's the first song in Hebrew songs. And the choreography. I don't know the choreography. I'm curious.
Oh no, it's just what we say here in the prayer.
Yeah. May the one who brings peace to God's universe bring peace to us and to all Israel. And it's that wherever we're coming from, whether we're in a place of trusting God or hoping that we can trust God, or just putting all of our trust in God, it's that hope that we'll be able to experience peace that's different than what we're feeling when we're in that period of mourning. Other thoughts or experiences or questions before we end for today? All right. I would encourage you to watch some of those videos that I sent earlier today, especially the ones from Bim Bam. They've got a whole lot of information and wonderful ways of different perspectives of looking at mourning in Judaism. And next week, I know that afterlife is something that people are really intrigued by. It's in Judaism, kind of one thesis is we don't really know what happens after death. There are a lot of different ideas, but we'll start out with that next week just because it's interesting to think about. But we'll start out with that next week. if you have the chance to read or watch a Holocaust memoir or documentary, to bring up in conversation. We'll talk about what we've learned, what we've seen, what we've heard next week when we talk about anti-Semitism, or when we talk about the Shoah. A lot to cover next week. Just one more week of not the happiest of topics, but if after this session you have more ideas, more questions, you want to talk about anything, I am happy to do so. I'm always here. So thank you for learning with me today, and I'm looking forward to learning with you next week and hopefully seeing all of you before then. Bye, everyone.